and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. The U.S. lead negotiator on North Korea offered new inducements for Pyongyang this week. Mr. Steve Biegun gave a green light to a number of inter-Korean projects and announced plans to reconsider restrictions on U.S. aid workers' travels to North Korea. Now, how will North Korea respond?
We will also review American citizen travel to DPRK for purposes of facilitating the delivery of aid.
In the studio with me today, Mr. James Schoff, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Mr. Schoff was a senior advisor for East Asia policy to the Secretary of Defense. Also joining me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, Special Representative Biegun gave a green light to a number of inter-Korean projects and also said that the U.S. government will review the travel ban and allow the humanitarian workers to enter into North Korea. So will this give a breakthrough to the current stalemate?
Well, I'm always glad to see a U.S. government official return to closer to what has been long-standing U.S. government policy, which is that humanitarian aid decisions, especially things like tuberculosis treatment or food for the hungry or outreach to the poor, should be separated from politics. So I think the intrusion of the political dynamic into the aid issue with North Korea was a mistake from the beginning. And I think this new announcement by Steve Biegun does indicate that the Trump administration seems willing to restore viability to some of this humanitarian outreach. But I don't anticipate that it'll have a big impact on the negotiations. I think the North Koreans also would prefer to keep these issues separate from the denuclearization question. And frankly, the amount of aid and engagement we're talking about is not on a scale that is large enough to really significantly affect North Korea's thinking about their future.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the near-term good outcome is has more to do with U.S.-South Korea relations right now, not necessarily the negotiations with North Korea. We've been under strain in terms of the Moon administration wanting to lean much farther forward on various inter-Korean projects and really trying to get the United States to be the one to make concessions or somehow reconcile with North Korea on some of these issues. So that's good. It's still not clear to me, though, how much some of these green lights are very short term. So they mentioned the railway project groundbreaking ceremony. But what about the railway project, kind of long term? I haven't seen much discussion about truly kind of structural exemptions for these sanctions, and many of them are not up to the United States alone to decide either. So there's a limit to how far that can go.
So, Frank, Special Representative Biegun, he said he hopes the discussions will enter into the next stage of denuclearization and then also set up for the next summit between U.S. and North Korea. And Secretary Pompeo also this week said that U.S. is hopeful that the second summit will be held not too long after the first of the year. So why do you think U.S. is very hopeful and anticipating about the second summit?
Well, Eun-jung, I believe that what Biegun is trying to do is to fulfill the president's wishes. And Trump has made very clear that he believes that this high-level engagement is essential to moving North Korea along the path toward denuclearization. And while there are many people in his government who support that goal, I think there's also a strong belief in the State Department, as well as the Pentagon and elsewhere, that such a summit meeting should be very carefully prepared. So Biegun's visit to Seoul, I agree with Jim very much. First mission was to make sure that the U.S. and South Korea are on the same page. But then the signaling to the North is that we are really in earnest our president wants to meet with Kim Jong-un again, that he hopes that there can be real progress, tangible progress on denuclearization that comes out of that meeting. But then the U.S. government is also sending the message to the North. And by the way, if you want that summit meeting to be successful, you need to sit down with us at the working level so that we can prepare. And I hope that happens. But I'm concerned that so far the North has been quite reluctant to meaningfully engage with Ambassador Began.
Well, and it's interesting to me that because we have the recent instance of North Korea kind of coming out with a KCNA editorial really clarifying what denuclearization means of the Korean Peninsula, meaning it includes steps by the United States and sanctions relief early on as part of corresponding measures. So in the lead up to this potential theoretical summit, both sides are setting the bar relatively high. The U.S. has been sending signals that if we have a summit, we really need detailed roadmap of denuclearization. We don't necessarily need a declaration up front, but soon thereafter we will. So really setting the bar high. And now you see North Korea coming back saying, that's not what our understanding of what a summit would be. We have a long way to go in building trust first, et cetera. So that could delay progress toward a summit unless there's some meeting of the minds there.
So yeah, Jim just mentioned about that statement. So is North Korea, as Jim said, just setting the bar high by saying this, or is North Korea saying that it will not denuclearize?
Well, on the one hand, there was little that was truly new in that statement. You can trace back years, even decades, similar statements out of North Korea that have either hinted or stated openly that denuclearization should include removal of what the North considers to be the U.S. threat, and that threat is sometimes very broadly defined to include U.S. forces in the region, in Korea, Japan, and Guam. Sometimes it's more narrowly defined in terms of a nuclear threat, but always the North Koreans insist that moves on their part in abandoning their nuclear weapons program should be met with comparable steps, corresponding measures, if you will, by the U.S. I think what was significant about this most recent statement is that it does remove some of the cloud of ambiguity about what the North Koreans are thinking of when they talk about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And what is revealed, unfortunately, is that there's a wide gulf between the U.S. definition and the North Korean definition. The North Koreans are including a very broad definition of the U.S. threat. And the U.S. side is really focused on the North Korean nuclear program, which is illicit, has been defined by the UN as illicit. And the U.S. has no intention, as far as I know, of significantly altering, their overall force posture in the Pacific in order to accommodate North Korean concerns.
So yeah, we all knew that was North Korean interpretation of denuclearization, but by North Korea specifically saying it out loud at this point, does that mean that the negotiations between U.S. and North Korea came to a dead end?
My impression is that this reflects a certain amount of frustration in North Korea with the continued characterization of the agreement in Singapore by the Secretary of State Pompeo and others as being the denuclearization of North Korea as agreed to by Chairman Kim. And they kept referring to that constantly. And to some extent, this is enough. That's not what we agreed to. There's nowhere in the Singapore statement that says the denuclearization of North Korea. Yes. And I think there's an element of trying to push back on this characterization or almost the feeling that the United States is trying to move the goalposts and change the nature of it. Some will interpret this, of course, to mean that North Korea is finally being upfront about the fact that they have no intention of denuclearizing at all. It calls into question the assurances by President Moon earlier that this time he's really serious. So that's tension is still there. But I agree. I don't think it's time to give up on this process. They're just saying it's not going to be quick and easy. And the way you have been describing it, you really need to engage us in this disarmament talks of sorts.
Is there a credibility issue with the South Korean government now? Does the Moon government have to step in and kind of explain their interpretation of North Korean intentions so far?
I don't think so. I don't think President Moon has misrepresented, what he's heard from Kim Jong-un. But I think it's always possible to hear the same words and interpret them differently. I think that even Secretary Pompeo, in his private discussions with Kim Jong-chol, may have been given reason to believe that the North Koreans do understand that we are talking about the denuclearization of North Korea. But for the U.S. to assert that publicly is something that invites, as Jim pointed out, North Korean pushback. I think Moon Jae-in believes that North Korea is serious about improving their relationship with the United States, and I think he's faithfully communicated that message to President Trump. I think President Moon may have glossed over some of the dirty details about how hard this is going to be, how North Korea is going to insist on important corresponding steps by the U.S.
So you're an expert in congressional relations, and Senator Cory Gardner, in response to the North Korean statement, said the potential summit is dead on arrival. So what is the sentiment in the Congress right now regarding continuing talks with North Korea?
Well, I think in my 15 years working on Capitol Hill, I learned that you can never overestimate the skepticism of Congress in trusting the word of North Korea. And I think many members of Congress are deeply skeptical, partly through experience. But I think it's premature, very premature, to label this process as somehow dead or dead on arrival. I think what we're seeing is that the overly optimistic read of President Trump coming out of the Singapore summit, the declaration that there's no more nuclear threat from North Korea, Kim and I have agreed to get rid of it, that was way premature. And now we're coming back to reality, which is that if this problem had been easy to solve, it would have been solved 70 years ago. And the Congress will support the president, I believe, in his engagement efforts, but they're going to remain skeptical. And they're going to demand verification. They're going to demand, careful scrutiny of what's actually happening on the peninsula.
Jim, I want to come back to the travel ban. So do you think there are other reasons other than giving a breathing new life into the denuclearization talks? Are there other reasons why U.S. government has decided to review this travel ban, do you think?
Well, when the travel ban or these very restrictive passport requirements for NGOs were announced, there was actually a decent amount of surprise here in Washington, in the sense that this was really going too far, bringing the NGOs and the humanitarian mission, kind of dragging it into the negotiations and into the politicizing that whole process. The programs, some of these health programs and community programs they've been doing for many years, and if they can't get the medications in or the doctors in to treat patients and see how they're doing, all that years of work could be lost, and they're beginning to see the practical impact of some of this. So I think part of it is to say, all right, maybe we've gone a little bit too far, we should review this and let some reasonable things go forward. And then it's also a very handy additional carrot. They've been looking for ways to incentivize a restart of the working level talks. They've talked about letting some of these initial projects go forward. And then this is a kind of an additional little incentive. But by itself, I don't necessarily see it as a big OG in North Korea. This is great. Let's go sit down and talk.
So the humanitarian aid to North Korea, U.S. government gave 500,000 tons of food to North Korea in 2008, and also 2012 Leap Day Agreement also included food aid to North Korea. So in the past, how did humanitarian aid help facilitate talks between U.S. and North Korea?
Well, I think the two go hand in hand, but I don't want to assign causation. I don't think that U.S. foreign aid policy toward North Korea significantly alters their security posture or their behavior in the security area.
And I would say that many Americans who had involvement in the six-party talks and the Leap Day deal and some of these initiatives on fuel oil and food aid are somewhat cynical or skeptical about that experience. In retrospect, when we look at it, all it did was divert where that funding was going. So I think some people in the administration are beginning to think that maybe infrastructure investment is a better incentive than food aid or humanitarian aid. Of course, humanitarian aid has its role, but infrastructure at least does not necessarily, you can have contractors from other countries, from South Korea, in doing the work. You're not necessarily giving fungible resources that line the pockets of the regime. So that could be a better incentive long term than just food aid.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to end it here and watch video for our next discussion.
They are hostage-taking, torture, and extrajudicial killing.
The parents of American college student Otto Warmbier filed a $1.1 billion lawsuit against North Korea. The lawsuit is possible because the Trump administration designated North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism last year. So, Frank, what are the chances that the family actually received this $1.1 billion from North Korea?
Well, there's no chance they're going to receive any kind of compensation on that order of magnitude from North Korea. The tragedy of Otto Warmbier, I think, moved many Americans. And when the president, at the State of the Union address in 2017, had the Warmbier parents in the hall with him, the president spent a long time talking about that tragedy. But I think it's really important for your viewers to understand that we don't know what happened to Otto. North Korea ultimately bears the responsibility for his death. And I think that is a message that the U.S. government should communicate to North Korea. There should be compensation and sincere apologies made by North Korea. But this lawsuit is more about reminding, I think, the North Korean government and the American people of the tragedy. And it's not going to prove, I'm sad to say, an effective mechanism for any kind of meaningful redress of this grievous tragedy.
Mm-hmm. So, Jim, U.S. government mentions Mr. Warmbier's name a lot recently, even in sanctions announcements. So what does Mr. Warmbier come to symbolize in the United States?
Well, certainly, I think in the beginning he really did symbolize this the face of the cruelty of the North Korean regime in power right now. He should never have actually even been detained in the first place. If he had done something wrong, he could have just been deported. So it was at a moment of maximum pressure when the Trump administration was really trying to put pressure on North Korea. That was a human embodiment of that reason for applying that pressure. I worry a little bit now that he's coming to symbolize a lack of attention on human rights issues by the Trump administration. Congress certainly is staying very focused on this. The Trump administration does continue to pay attention to this, and they care about it, but clearly the focus is on the denuclearization piece, and I think in some ways this case is a way of reminding the Trump administration not to forget the human rights dimension, and we need to make sure this is a part of the discussion, at least up front, so that we're not tossing it in later in the negotiations with North Korea and then being surprised and at that time.
I think Jim makes a really important point, because the contrast between the demonization of the North Korean state and its leadership by President Trump in the first months of his administration, holding up the Warmbier case as example number one, with the Kim and I have a love affair, he's my buddy, I trust him, he's sincere. The contrast between these two different postures by President Trump is glaring. It's really stark. And I think the administration would have been much better served if they had neither demonized the North to the extent they did in the face of this tragedy, nor sanitized the North to the extent that President Trump has in recent months. We need to be consistent in our messaging to North Korea. We're concerned about their human rights record. Their human rights record is horrible, and at some point we're going to need to address it. if we want to have a truly normal, healthy relationship with North Korea. That should be the message, and it shouldn't change whether the North Koreans are cooperating with the U.S. on denuclearization or not.
I want to push back a little bit on that because apart from President Trump having a good relationship with Chairman Kim Jong-un, I think U.S. government has been very consistent in expressing concerns about Mr. Warmbier, and the prime example is mentioning his names in all these announcements and statements regarding North Korea.
It matters, though, at what level. I mean, I don't disagree with you, Yoon Jong. You raise a good point that at the working level, the case has never been completely forgotten. But there was a time when the President of the United States was sitting in the hall of the Congress calling out the parents of Otto. And then there's been, a 180-degree shift in the President's rhetoric. And if you're sitting in Pyongyang, that's the voice you care most about. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that Pompeo or Began may complain about Otto's case, I don't think it carries the same weight.
Jim?
Yeah, I mean, we had the UN vote recently criticizing North Korean human rights, and certainly the United States was very supportive of that initiative, and some other criticisms on sanctions against a couple of individuals in North Korea because of human rights. But they do seem to happen or come about from the administration when we're at an impasse or we're trying to apply some kind of pressure on North Korea. And then when things are going well, we kind of forget about it and step back. So I think we've been hearing about it more recently because we've been in this impasse. And I just agree on the consistency point. This is a principle that, yes, you're going to maybe press a little harder or a little less strongly at different times when the relationship is moving forward. But this is a fundamental gap and issue in the U.S.-North Korea relationship, among many others. And I haven't seen the same kind of consistency there.
Well, we'll discuss more as the case proceeds, and let's now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of a South Korean youth group called Welcome Committee for a Great Man, seeking donations from passers-by to run a subway advertisement to welcome Chairman Kim Jong-un. More than a dozen civic groups are formed in South Korea to welcome Kim, and conservative civic groups filed a complaint to the prosecution against them for breaching the National Security Act. Frank, what's your reaction?
Well, there was a time in South Korea where any expression of welcome or empathy or even modest support for North Korea would have been criminal. And I think that frankly was a shameful period in South Korea's history where freedom of expression and freedom of speech were severely constrained by the national security law. I will say that I think it's as likely that the protest groups will be out on the streets in force as that the welcome groups will be. South Korea has a vibrant democracy, and I think both those organizing here to welcome Chairman Kim's visit, they will be met, I bet you, in kind by those who are going to be protesting his visit.
Well, my quick initial reaction is to be reminded of the Koreanness of this issue and this problem. You know, we talk in Washington all the time about strategies for denuclearization, etc. But if Kim Jong-un goes to Seoul, if inter-Korean projects and exchanges really begin to increase, there's a human dimension to that. There's a national dimension to that is good, I think, for Americans to be reminded of. You know, I've often said the only irreversible step in this denuclearization process that could be taken is Kim Jong-un going to Seoul, because he can't ungo to Korea and see what's going on there. And as much as people worry about what would be the impact on South Korea and South Korean politics if he were to come, I also think there's some benefit to really he and his entourage seeing with their own eyes. I'm sure they've seen pictures of Seoul and South Korea before, but there could be some benefit in that regard as well, and hopefully in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to end it here. Mr. Jannuzi, Mr. Schoff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Yoon Jung.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.